Welcome to an episode of the Peel Good Podcast. I'm your host, Emily Knowles, the Client Account Manager for Clementine Creative Agency. And I'm actually here with a returning host, Jennifer Nilsson, the Managing Director and Co-Founder of Clementine Creative Agency. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Emily.
How's it going?
Going well. Glad to be here.
Yes, I know. Every time we film with you, it's a little different because in our first season, you were our first filming from home during the height of the pandemic. But now in the second season, we're back in the office and you're our first filming in studio.
I know. You like to experiment on me.
Yeah, we like to switch it up a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
And
keep us on our toes.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do with this topic too, because we're going to tap into something that we haven't really talked about before. And it's this idea of native advertising. So, and I mean, native advertising can be kind of controversial in topic.
It can.
But let's identify native advertising first. What is native advertising?
So native advertising really is content that a brand produces and pays to place on a third-party platform. And sort of the qualifying, descriptor is that it is designed to blend in with the look and feel of that platform where it's placed. So you can think about this like sort of a traditional example is kind of an editorial style like advertorial piece where it's placed in a publication and it's sort of designed to look like it's part of the editorial content. Right. But obviously native advertising goes way beyond those types of advertorial placements now. So you could be talking about anything from like sponsored content in social media feeds, product placement type things, infographics or video content. There's a lot of different ways to do it.
Right. And so what's the difference in that and content marketing? Because it sounds like native advertising is more of like performative marketing because it's cohesive and well designed to fit in and integrate with the feel of the digital platform it's on.
Right.
But with content marketing, what's the difference there?
Yeah, there's all of these terms that fly around in digital advertising. Technically, I guess how you distinguish the two is content marketing would be the brand producing that content and publishing it on their own platform, like on a platform that they own themselves. So think about you're writing for a blog that's on your own website. Yeah. That's really content marketing. That's you building a content footprint. But it doesn't involve a third party.
Yeah.
Whereas native advertising involves you taking that content and paying to place it on a third party platform.
Right. Yeah. Something that comes to mind for me is the other day I was making a recipe and the recipe I was following had a lot of Campbell like soup and ingredients. And I was like, it's kind of weird. I feel like I'm using a lot of Campbell ingredients. Get to the end of it, it's all sponsored. The whole ingredient recipe is sponsored by Campbell's.
Absolutely.
So there's that form of native advertising there. But when it's well integrated like that and it doesn't feel, something that's outright deceitful, but sometimes it can come across deceiving because it's so well blended. You kind of get caught at the end like, oh, that was just a sponsored ad, kind of like me with that recipe. Mm-hmm. So is that where it becomes controversial?
Yeah, I mean, native advertising is a little bit of a controversial topic, and it is mainly for that reason. There's a potential for a transparency issue around native advertising because just like you with your Campbell's recipe, although I hope it turned out well and was
amazing,
tasty,
delicious,
which most of them are when you get to the end of the recipe. But if you have a situation where somebody clicks through on something and they read a piece or they get a recipe and they get to that point where they realize it's an ad, just like you did, and they have a negative reaction to that, that's where you run into a potential issue, right? Because nobody likes to feel like they got tricked into something or like they fell for the clickbait or something like that, and so that creates that negative experience around the brand. The other thing to keep in mind there too is that, there's a risk of negativity toward the brand that's placing it. Depending on the type of native advertising you're talking about, there's also a risk for the publisher themselves, because if you think about if you're the New York Times and you run a piece that's native advertising from some brand that creates a lot of negativity and pushback or people feel like there's an issue with the transparency around that and knowing that it's advertising content, then that can also erode the trust in the publisher themselves and not just in the brand that's involved. So from that perspective, it can be something of a higher stakes in terms of the potential for negativity around native advertising placements.
Yeah, I think it follows along the line too of when people go to an app. So we're talking, just TikTok, for example, there are a lot of eyes on TikTok currently because it's a robust platform and everyone's on it. And, it's kind of the new trending, platform. But when we're on there and I'm scrolling and I see a video that looks very similar to any other TikTok because they're using a similar trend, a similar trending sound, and then by the end of it, I'm seeing hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored. It kind of gives me a sense of, I'm already followed around by ads so much. I have this sort of ad fatigue that gets taken on. So when I'm being followed again to a platform, which, when you have eyeballs on a screen, that's where your advertisers are going to go.
Of course, yeah.
But then when it feels like it's kind of just being roped into what you're already seeing and then it then you're kind of caught up in the, it's just sponsored content.
Right.
That's where, like, you know, ad fatigue plus the deceitfulness kind of comes into play. And then people start getting chased off those platforms. But
I mean, something that we know audiences value a lot, you know, today maybe more than ever, is authenticity.
Yeah.
And that's where, you know, that difference between your expectation and the reality when you get to the end of that experience can be kind of a letdown if you feel like, you know, there's a lack of authenticity or transparency into, like, you roped me into this thing and, you know, it was all just an ad.
Right.
You know?
Well, and I think on the flip side of that too, though, like if you had someone who was sponsored by a brand and so they're like putting out this really nice like video and content creation around this certain product by the brand, and then they don't use that hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored, but later on you find out they're paid for it. It's kind of like, that's also deceitful. So at least the ethics is there of like adding that hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you want to see, is bringing that transparency around the process. Because certainly when someone does do, you know, if you have an influencer, someone who's doing something for a brand and they're, you know, not disclosing that they're being paid for that, that can create a lot of negativity and a lot of trust issues there. But, you know, that sort of transparency around saying, hey, it's an ad, you know, there are different levels of that as well, right? Like, did I tell you up front that this is an ad? Did I tell you at the end that this is an ad? Like, how deeply is it buried? And all of those factors, you know, can affect, I think, the reaction that people have and the expectation that people have when they get into that kind of content.
Right. So I think pairing, like with native advertising, pairing it with, you know, the authenticity of it, because you're still knowing that it's sponsored, even if it may be at the end that it becomes revealed. But it's also someone who works in advertising but also is actively on social media and gets fed ads all the time. I'm kind of thankful when there's a way that you can be more creative in seeing an ad. So as much as I have ad fatigue from ads in general across platforms and whatnot, at least with native advertising, it's kind of combating that ad fatigue.
Yeah, and you know, that's the flip side of native advertising. You know, you think of it as a little bit higher risk, but like anything in life, a little bit higher risk, maybe a little bit higher reward, right? And there's a lot of research out there that shows that native advertising is highly effective, you know, that it tends to get a lot more views than display advertising, that it tends to get a lot more click-throughs than more traditional digital display ads. There are certain demographics, particularly younger demographics, millennials and Gen Z, that have expressed, you know, in survey research, just outright said, I prefer this kind of ad, even though I know it's an ad. You'd rather have it presented in that format. And, you know, you talk about ad fatigue, and when you think about traditional display advertising in a digital sense, not old school traditional display advertising, but, you know, you hit all of these websites or apps or whatever, and you're inundated with like pop-ups, and there's ads all around the edge of the page and on the border, and, you know, implemented in all these different places, and your eyes get really, really good at just tuning that stuff out, because we're all used to seeing so much of it on a daily basis. You're just inundated with it. You don't even look at that part of the page.
I'm so guilty of just hitting the X as soon as a pop-up comes up. I don't even read it. I'm guilty of that.
No guilt for your fellow marketers. No. You don't care.
I'm sorry.
No, I understand, because they do the same thing. It's just, you know, we're all conditioned that way. And so native advertising, when it's done well, is a way that you can kind of get around that sort of ad fatigue, because you're embedding it into the flow of content that you're looking at, and hopefully you're doing it well, and that content is actually relevant or useful or interesting to the people you're talking to.
So who is someone who does it well then? Because what comes to mind for me, I know Snapchat being a big thing back in my high school days, like there would be brands who would sponsor filters on Snapchat. And so Taco Bell, for example, Cinco de Mayo, they maybe sponsored a filter, and then you would use that filter, but you know, like it's a fun filter, so people are using it, but at the end of the day, it's an advertisement for Taco Bell. Right. So I feel like that's done very well, but what's something that comes to mind for you that where native advertising is done well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different ways to do native advertising. You know, one of the good things about it is when you're producing this kind of content, there are a lot of different ways that you can do it, a lot of different formats that you can do it. So it is something that you can be kind of fun and creative about, hopefully, and it's a different way to connect with the audience. You know, one of the things that comes to mind for me is kind of one of the classic native advertising examples, which was the partnership between Spotify and Stranger Things when Stranger Things launched on Netflix.
Right.
And they did a partnership where you could actually change Spotify into like Stranger Things mode.
Ooh.
And based on your listening habits and, you know, what Spotify knows about you,
Yeah.
it would match you up with a playlist that was inspired by one of the characters on Stranger Things. And it like changed the interface. And so that's kind of, you know, a neat way for those two brands to partner. But it's not necessarily your traditional, you know, like watch Stranger Things ad. It's just a way that it's integrating it into other things that you like. You know, hey, we know you like these songs. Hey, you'll probably like this too. And it's a more fun and engaging way to do that kind of content.
Right.
So,
and I'm sure that was successful because Stranger Things, we know, took off.
Yes,
so it benefited Spotify
successful.
just as much as it probably benefited Stranger Things.
Yes, it was wildly successful for both brands. And I think that's a great, I mean, obviously those are very large brands, a very sort of elite level example.
Right.
But those are the kinds of things that I think work really well from a native advertising perspective, because it is content that's like fun for the audience to engage with, right? And do you know it's an ad? Yes, you know it's an ad. Obviously, it's an ad. There's a big Stranger Things logo across the top of the screen.
Spotify doesn't just love Stranger Things that much to showcase it every day.
They didn't declare Stranger Things Day just for the fun of it. But it's something that's fun, and I think that's something that people don't mind engaging with in that sense. I mean, we all know that we're being marketed to all of the time online. So if you can find ways to make that experience more creative and more positive and do that in a different way, then I think, you know, those kinds of things are really interesting.
Yeah, you make a good point on the creative standpoint, because us as a creative agency, we're always looking for those things that are outside the box. And so native advertising really allows you to tap into that. And the creative element is so much, which marketing really should take on that creative element, because you do see advertising every day. And sometimes traditional advertising or the traditional digital efforts in advertising work, but we see how successful it can be in native advertising, even with its controversial side to it.
Sure.
So what are the pitfalls that you're trying to avoid as if you're native advertising?
I mean, I think the first pitfall is just really the most basic that we've talked about, and it's transparency and authenticity. Like, don't try to be sneaky.
No.
People know it's an ad. It doesn't even matter in a lot of cases, you know, like that, the research I was talking about, you know, with Gen Y and Gen Z, they know it's an ad. Like, we already know it's an ad. You're not fooling anyone.
You are not fooling
us. So don't
us.
try to fool anyone, you know. Just don't try to get around the rules. Go ahead and disclose that up front, you know, and make it a positive experience that people don't mind engaging with.
Right.
So I think that's, you know, just the first base level foundational, you know, what you need to start with from a native advertising perspective. Just don't try to be tricky.
Yeah, I like to say authentic marketing is important marketing, because that's really what's going to reach your audience and allow for that transparency, because everyone knows there's advertising out there and what's being fed to you. But like you said, don't try and hide it.
No. And I think the other, you know, basic rule, like we talk about with everything, is make it good, right? You know, I mean, all of really marketing and branding is about creating these unique and positive experiences with your brand. So native advertising is just one more avenue that you can use to do that. And it opens up maybe some different avenues, because it allows you to reach different people than the content that you would produce on your own.
Right.
But, you know, something that's very high quality, that's very targeted to your customer base, the audience that you're trying to talk to. You know, talking about examples, another one that I think is interesting was, I think it was last year, Allbirds did a partnership with New York Times. It was a placement in the New York Times. And they wrote an editorial piece. It was in the online edition. It actually has like a lovely animation on it. It's really lovely, creative. We should link it up somewhere and share it, because it's very pretty.
If you like hummingbirds, you would love it.
Yes, it's very pretty. But what it was, the editorial was actually about a conservation, and it was specifically about birds and imperiled sort of bird species and how that affects the rest of our ecosystem and our world and our environment. Now, you know, that's not what Allbirds is about. Obviously, they're a fashion brand, and, you know, you think Allbirds, you think shoes. The article was not about, hey, check out our cool shoes.
No.
It was an article that was focused on that sustainability and conservation piece, which is a core tenet of Allbirds' brand, right? They're a brand that's all about sustainability. So that's a different way to take information that's not salesy, that would be interesting to sort of a like-minded audience, to the same type of audience that's likely to be attracted to a sustainability-based brand, by tapping into that kind of content.
Yeah.
So I think when you think about native advertising, you can think outside the possibilities a little bit of just your standard, like, here's my product, call to action type of advertising format. You have a lot more room to do interesting things when you bring those third-party platforms into the mix.
And that could have been just an ordinary blog post. Like, it could have just been complete copy, maybe a picture or two. But this one was it was interactive. It was, the creative design element of it all was so eye-catching, and it just kind of made someone take a look at it and really take it in and really want to read through the content of it and what they were trying to convey because of that creative element that was placed there.
Yeah, and it tells you right at the top on the page, like, New York Times in partnership with Allbirds, and their logo is up there. Like, it's sponsored content. You know that it's an advertising placement, but you don't mind because, it's interesting, relevant information. And that's, really what we talk about all the time with any kind of advertising or any kind of content marketing or branding. It's about, relevancy to your audience and sort of meeting them where they are. So if you're able to tap into those sort of shared values and get your brand in front of people that way who are likely to be attracted to your brand with something that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the actual product that you sell, then, that's a great opportunity. And it's just a different kind of opportunity that you can add into the digital marketing mix. It doesn't necessarily replace your traditional display advertising or things like that, but it's a different lever that you can kind of pull on the marketing side. Yeah,
I think, and that's a great example to leave off on because, native advertising as a whole is just providing content in a format that meets someone where they're at authentically, like we've been talking about, that will allow someone to further engage and let that lead to conversion of whatever you may be selling, but from such an authentic, creative place. And when you're being so sure, people can see it as deceitful when it's just like they get through an ad and then at the end of it it's sponsored or whatever. But if you're meeting someone where they're at and they can appreciate the ad that's there, that then can lead them to further involve themselves with the brand or product, that's like the big takeaway that you're getting there.
Yeah, and I think that's why some of the best examples of native advertising are those that maybe focus more on shared value than on pushing product. And you'll see a lot of that kind, particularly when you do editorial style content, but also there are fun things that you can kind of interact with. I know some of the streaming services have done like little interactive quizzes and infographics and things like, which series should you be streaming? And, obviously they're promoting the shows that are on their service. But those are the kinds of, like fun time wasters that everybody loves to play with online.
BuzzFeed should just be called native advertising at this point.
Pretty much. Yeah, that's pretty much the basis of that whole platform.
Yeah, so I think, if you had to give one takeaway other than just authentically marketing to people through native advertising, what would be one big takeaway from it?
I mean, I think it's just to stay true to your brand, and that's, that kind of plays into authenticity as well, but you have to be authentic in the way you're presenting it to customers. You have to be authentic to yourself as well, right? The things that work really, really well are those that are very true to the brand that is producing them. I think you see a lot of great content out there. But you can't necessarily just go out and copy what somebody else did because that worked well. I mean, you talked about the Taco Bell Snapchat filter, right? I mean, that's very much sort of in their brand voice. They have like a younger, it's more fun. It's, very casual, that kind of thing. That's not something that's going to work for every brand that's out there.
It made sense for Taco Bell.
Exactly.
Maybe not so much for, Keds, like the shoe, like would you have just a shoe filter that's over your face? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
That's kind of, that would be bizarre, right?
Exactly.
And so I think it's about, not only being true and truthful to the audience that you're trying to talk to, but being true and truthful to the brand that you're representing, and then to be creative about it and have a little fun with it. Think outside the box about different ways that you can engage that audience.
The creative aspect.
Just make sure that you're coming at it from a place that's real and true to your brand and the heart of what what your brand stands for and what you want to sort of the level that you want to connect with people on.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun moving forward from this conversation in the event that I have native advertising come across my screen, not being like oh, I got you, you almost got me type, it's more like I'm appreciating this, honestly, because I could have just gotten a pop-up, but instead this is being, as long as it's authentic to that brand and it makes sense for their brand voice and not just trying to do something extra in order to capture attention, it'll be a lot better in receiving it from my end.
Yeah, and I think that's the key in native advertising, right? If it is done well, then it can be a positive experience.
You turn deceitful into appreciation, so deception into appreciation, so I think it comes like a big turnaround.
Right, you're exceeding expectations for advertising from a certain perspective, I think.
Well, thank you for your time today, Jennifer. I think that people can get a good takeaway on native advertising who may not even know what native advertising was to begin with. So some people may just see it as sponsored content, and it is, but there is an overall bigger term that many things fall under this umbrella.
Yeah, digital advertising is such a big world. There's all of these little lanes that you can kind of get into, so it's hard to keep track of all the possibilities sometimes, but I think that this is a really fun one. So
I look forward to seeing more native advertising.
Oh yes, me too.